already. I think I've got it this time. I think I've got it, gentlemen.
No, it's YouTube is trying to shut us down.
Yeah, exactly.
Typical. Band.
That's exactly.
You don't want people to know the truth about the peanut butter review.
It's actually funny that he does it like 5 times within the same video.
Yeah, well, he actually does it every time. I missed one. He does it on every peanut butter jar he tests, except the traditional Kraft Smooth.
The worst peanut butter? Well, that makes sense. It's the worst.
Yeah, I said that's the, like, he could say what he wants, but that's the real test right there. Did he lick the spoon? He even licked the spoon after Wow Butter.
That just shows you, like, how generically hard it is to fuck peanut butter up. That, 7 of the 8 or 8 of the 9 are good enough?
Yeah.
It's pretty, to be honest, pretty terrible product to review. It's like
Squawk reviews.
It's like those
reviews.
Academic things where you like know the answer already, but you have to like prove it just to like for good science. It's like the same thing as peanut butter review.
Yeah.
But you know the answer already. You know, all natural peanut butters are the exact fucking same. Get over it.
The only difference is like a slight like roasting. maybe they source their peanuts from a different farm.
A little bit of a difference in salt.
So are we starting?
Oh yeah, we've started. It's 1.5 minutes of excellent peanut butter content.
Very necessary.
So we'll just
what are we doing?
What we're doing today is the opioid crisis. So that's the crisis that struck predominantly the United States and Canada, and has pretty much ravaged both countries since the 90s. So do you want
to... I think there's like 2 phases, if you want to say.
3
since the 90s.
Well, there's been 3 waves since the 90s, but it's been going on for roughly like 30 years. So
but there's like the opioid prescription crisis where doctors are giving out opioids to everyone, which got a lot of people addicted, and then currently that has transitioned to the illegal opioid market blowing up and filling with fentanyl, which is killing people.
Wow, way too you didn't even put a spoiler in there.
Yeah, no, that's the end of the stream, guys.
All right. Podcast.
But just I find it weird, like, if opioid crisis means both of those things, because like they seem quite distinct from what I was looking at.
Well, see, that's the thing that I guess we'll get into it probably, but I disagree. Like, one of my initial, before doing any research, I actually had the same like disjointed thought, whereas like there's 2 different, or like there was like different problems that weren't linked, but it's actually just all plays into
Oh, they're linked, but I'd say there's difference, like, you know, the First World War and the Second World War. Like, they obviously can have the Second World War without the First, but they're not the same
actual
event.
So the actual why don't we just take it in steps?
Yeah, I think we're gonna get ourselves derailed already. I think
spoiling it.
I think the way that we need to just do this
Game of Thrones season 8.
Yeah, gonna write ourselves into a corner here. Well, let's just start with initial thoughts for, like, before we started the research. Do you want to kick it off, Hubbards, with your initial thoughts before you started doing any sort of research, and then Price, you can take over, and I'll round it out.
Yeah, I guess. So basically, before I did my research, I thought, well, I guess the demographics that I thought it was affecting was skewed younger, say like 20 to 40-year-old kind of age group, predominantly like lower socioeconomic class, mostly males, and more heavily Caucasian, especially in the U.S. And then the U.S. I thought was more like a prescription problem, and then Canada was more like an illegal drugs problem. Few other thoughts I put down was like the pandemic has like made things worse, because I heard a few things about that. And then like the reason for it was essentially like a lot of people willing to do opioids because they were kind of down and out on their luck, and mostly related to like this is why kind of I had the demographic prediction, was because it's mostly like purposeless men that don't have jobs essentially, or don't have meaningful jobs. You know, in and out of employment, their jobs aren't capable of supporting a stable life. And then further than that, also like the general increase in isolation and loneliness in society over the last couple decades, I think also played a part, or at least those are my thoughts. And then overdoses are just like why do they happen? Well, just because of the natural consequence of drug use. Like, it's not like most people go into using opioids with the intention of that. Well, at least this, yeah, my thinking was you don't go into it hoping to die or anything. It's just like you progress with your tolerance gets higher, your demand for stronger high ramps up, and then eventually you just hit a level that it's just you're playing with fire every time you use, and then eventually you OD, and then probably if it's not, it only takes a handful of OD events, because most overdoses aren't fatal, but it only takes a few, and then you're probably one of them is going to eventually get you. And I also had heard a lot about fentanyl, and I just knew fentanyl was a lot worse than heroin and bad. That's kind of what I knew before doing any research.
Bryce, your thoughts initially before you started doing any sort of research into the topic?
Yeah, so I thought opioids were just incredibly addictive substances that, to my understanding, had caused multiple crises throughout human history. Pretty much any time humans came into contact with it and became addicted to it. And that wasn't acknowledged in around the 1980s, 1990s in the medical community, or the evidence of it was ignored in favor of very suspicious evidence that opioids weren't extremely addictive and wouldn't snowball into a huge societal problem once you started prescribing them. And so they started prescribing them and made billions of dollars off of this using their shoddy research. And that was basically the route that I saw before, or understood before researching anything. And the opioid crisis itself was a term I first heard in the late 2000s. And with respect to the overprescription of opioids and the problems that was causing with addiction, when people couldn't get them legally, they were turning to the streets. And then fentanyl was killing people because it was super light and strong. And drug dealers were cutting all of their opioids with fentanyl in order to get a stronger high, and just because it was extremely easy to smuggle in. And my understanding as to why this caused deaths was because inexperienced users would take too much, or bad drug dealers would cut their products incorrectly and the dosage wouldn't be correct. And that there's not really a clear-cut solution because they're so addictive.
All right. My initial view is actually pretty similar to both of yours. I thought it's a predominantly younger male and white problem, particularly in the States, like Hubbard said, but also really bad in BC, British Columbia, and Canada. And I thought mostly caused by overprescription of the pills, which then when somebody gets cut off, they have to go find it on the streets. And then once they go find it on the streets, that runs the risk of having a drug that is cut, like Price said, incorrectly. And with the cheap and plentiful fentanyl, you can wind up getting a lot of bad cuts and therefore you can get a lot of ODs, which, like, again, it's not somebody trying to OD, but just it's the nature of the beast when it comes to fentanyl. Is it's so powerful that if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you're probably going to fuck up a dose at least once, and if nobody finds you, you're pretty much done. And I thought it was something like, it really started in earnest in the early 2010s, because that's when I started hearing about it. But I had known that the actual pill problem had been a bit earlier than that, but so maybe early 2000s, somewhere around there. That's my initial view on it. So, do we want to give a quick overview of what we think the majority societal take is on it? What did you guys, I guess through the grapevine of society, what have you guys noticed that the perceptions that society has around it? Is it concerned?
Well,
is it not concerned?
I would say like our initial like unresearched takes is probably fairly close to the society's takes, at least for me, because I didn't do much research on this topic ever, so I never had like a heterodox or like the only thing that I differed in terms of like the mainstream is like it always, whenever like you hear in the mainstream media, it's always like the fentanyl or whatever is being used to like poison the drug supply, which I always thought was like, no, like that's stupid. Like people are intentionally putting fentanyl in it because it's a cheaper and better high, and it actually increases demand. Like, because the media always seems like kind of dumbfounded that people would go seek out drug dealers that have like knowingly cut their supply with fentanyl. Like, oh, well, why would you go to a place that peddles poison? Like, a poison drug, a tainted supply. It's like, it's not tainted, it's enhanced.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, they're going to it specifically because they know there's fentanyl in it, which is a better high, it's cheaper. And so that was like the one area of society, like the mainstream media coverage, that I always like found just ridiculous. But aside from that, it's pretty like fairly in line with my like unresearched view, because I never did much research on it.
I would say the biggest difference in like the society I am around between my perspective and the general perspective would probably be that I think there's still a very strong undercurrent of blaming drug addicts for their deaths, and also stereotyping these drug addicts as effectively lower income and or homeless as a pretext to being drug addicted, rather than potentially, if they are lower income or homeless, having that be caused by drug addiction or various underlying mental illnesses. Basically dismissive, more dismissive, and a sense that for most people that it couldn't happen to them or people they care about, which I think is relatively naive, but it's also difficult to admit that it could happen to people you care about. It's just something to worry about.
I would say that I agree with Hubbard's. A lot of my view is probably the mainstream view, just because I haven't done any of the real research until now. I would say that there is a pretty decent amount of stigma around being a drug addict on this. I think a lot of people do view it as like, well, the people who are doing this drug or like doing opioids and then overdose, a lot of them are just random homeless people. It's not anybody but these types of people. So I think there's probably a little bit of a lack of understanding that quite a few people, at least from like my perspective, that I had absorbed through some channel, was that it was actually pretty common for it to happen to people who were relatively regular people. I think that might also just be a consequence of living in British Columbia, where the crisis is really bad and it's spread to maybe a lot of, I guess, be working class, but other than that, regular people, not just like the homeless. So that would be my view of how the society views it. So going from there, I think we can jump into some history and the context from the research. Price, do you want to?
Yeah, so I was interested in looking into the history of opioid crises in recent history, due to the fact that formed a large part of my preconception as to the opioid crisis that was currently ongoing, in that my mental framework was such that opioids are extremely addictive, and this can be found repeatedly throughout history. So I went back to the Opium Wars, which I remember when I was naive, I thought they were going to war to get opium from China because they wanted the drugs. But I have since learned that when the British occupied India, they produced a large amount of opium, and their merchants would smuggle this opium into China to sell it, because at that point in time, in the early 1800s, China was an industrial powerhouse that produced a lot of things that the Western world would pay good money for. And it was cheaper for them than paying good money, which was silver at that time. It was cheaper for them to grow and smuggle in opium and trade for these products. And so this trade exploded because the products from China were highly sought after. But the opium that was coming into China through this trade was causing massive societal problems. And so the empire decided that they wanted to shut down the opium trade and went after these British merchants. And the British Empire did not take kindly to their merchants being attacked and their products being destroyed. So they rolled in and went to war with China and defeated them and took a bunch of concessions, which made it much easier for their merchants to have access to the Chinese markets. And incidentally, it allows more smuggling because now they control whole cities and tracts of land. And this happened a second time as well, because there were two opium wars.
Isn't that where they got Hong Kong?
Yeah, they got Hong Kong the first time, and then they got more areas of land around Hong Kong the second time. And the second time, the rest of Europe had seen what happened, and they wanted in. So it was a united Europe going into China to get legation cities, port cities that they could trade from. And Americans in particular, because they were a growing nation in the early 1800s, they had a lot of dynasties formed on the back of buying specifically Turkish opium and shipping that Turkish opium to China, and then shipping Chinese goods to America. And the Delanos and the Forbes and many other wealthy American dynasties started their exponential wealth growth on the back of the opium trade.
It's really interesting.
Globalism, baby.
Yeah. So then China got it real bad. About 10% of their population was estimated to smoke opium because that was the primary mode of consumption. And after China, the U.S. Civil War kicked off an American opioid crisis, which I would say is the first American opioid crisis, which was using opium to deal with soldiers' wounds and permanent disabilities that were caused by the war. And by the year 1895, estimates put 1 in 200 Americans as being addicted to opium. And the reasoning behind why they used opium in the 1800s to deal with these issues is that the understanding of medicine was rudimentary, and they didn't know how to get at the root of an issue. So their solution was to deal with the symptoms of the issue, and opium will dull the senses to the vast majority of medical problems you could have. So morphine especially was almost used as like a wonder drug. If a woman was having a menstrual cramps, they hit her with opium. If a woman's having a panic attack, hit her with morphine. If a soldier's got a aching leg or can't sleep, hit him with some morphine. Constipation, or actually no, it was diarrhea, because morphine has constipating properties. Hit him with some morphine, fix their diarrhea.
What a time to be alive.
And and so by the late 1800s, once a significant chunk of the population was addicted to opioids, especially morphine, the medical practitioners actually began to push back against this, and textbooks and medical best practice changed to de-emphasize the use of morphine and to say that in most situations where morphine was being used, it should not be being used. And it took about 30 or 40 years before you really saw the decline of morphine users. But there was a lot of legal fighting, a prohibition, and not an intentional prohibition, but laws to restrict opiums that were enforced as such to make it an effective prohibition. And that pushed it back underground. And heroin obviously was around from the early 1900s until now, but it never reached the heights of 1895 again until the mid 2000s. And as of 2017, 0.6% of the population of America is considered to be addicted to opioids, which puts them at 20% higher rate than they were in 1895.
That's a really interesting swing. You go from a crisis 100 years ago or so, even more, to having it all happen again.
And one anecdote that I like is Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist, refused to ever use any painkillers because he believed they clouded your mind. And he had medical training, so he probably was trained during the era in which morphine was demonized. And he also had a friend who was addicted to morphine. So he had jaw surgery to remove a tumor because he smoked so many cigars he got jaw cancer and refused to take painkillers until he finally died from doctor-assisted suicide with an overdose of morphine.
So he wound up going down that road anyways. That's a really interesting, long history. Hubbards, do you have anything to add from more recent? We could kind of get into the deep dive into the recent, the start of the modern crisis, I think. Unless you got anything else, Price.
I don't have much to add to any of that.
What I kind of touched on in my research, but not deeply, was OxyContin seems to be the original drug that would be said to have kicked off the opioid epidemic.
The modern one, you mean?
Yeah. Did anyone research that significantly?
I did not. I did research Purdue a little bit, but I think we can get into that in terms of later on when we actually do the full dive. So I think we can just jump right into the modern one. It's interesting to see that cycles of history seem to repeat themselves. Speaking of how do you pronounce it? OxyContin?
I think that's how it's spelled.
Yeah, that's how it sounds like it's a strange.
Cotton.
It's a strange spelling. It means continuous use, right? Or continuous, because it's a long delay capsule.
Yeah, it's
supposed to be 12 hours.
Release.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons it's such a powerful drug. It's supposed to be like a 12-hour drug, and heroin doesn't last nearly that long. So I believe that was released in 1992. I think that's when that first came out.
Sounds right.
Yeah. And so I think from my research into the current situation, just a brief overview, there seems to be 3 waves of the modern crisis. So there was the first wave starting in the early 90s, where they started to develop these drugs like OxyContin, which were opioids but legal prescriptions. This first wave lasted quite a long time. It started in early 90s and ran all the way to roughly the 2010s, like early 2010s, and then you had the second wave, which was the heroin epidemic, which started in around 2009, 2010, and that ran for a few years, and then now fentanyl and other analogs to fentanyl kicked in the 2013 to 2016, and which has kicked off another wave, a very deadly wave. So these are the three big time periods, and the three different.
The heroin epidemic is something that I never ran across or encountered in anything that I was reading about. So if you could just explain that.
Well, I can contextualize it for BC at least, and this comes from the Lancet. Basically, in the early 90s, there was a rise in drug overdoses that was attributed to heroin and cocaine simultaneous injections. And this is all British Columbia numbers, so I mean, as far as I know, this is also analogous to what happened in both the US and the rest of Canada, but this is just going to be specifically BC numbers. So in 1993, it peaked at 330 drug overdose deaths in BC for that year.
Oh, yeah.
And then what happened was they started cracking down on the drugs, started safe injection sites, that kind of thing, health interventions, and it started tapering off. And then there was a huge wave of since 2000, essentially, there was basically a massive introduction of prescription opioids, and for at least for Canada, in the peak 2008 to 2010, as many as 1 in 5 Canadians had used a prescription opioid, medical grade opioid, and then in Canada they started actually after about 2010, they started a campaign to stop overprescription and cut down on prescriptions of opioids, and that just happened to coincide with the introduction of fentanyl into Canada in 2012. So just as the legal supply of opioids was drying up because they were cutting down on prescriptions, a huge new influx of fentanyl, which is much more deadly than heroin even, started coming into Canada. So it was the perfect brew for a massive increase in opioid overdose deaths, which tracks. In 2017 there was 1,473 overdose deaths in BC. So the worst year in the 90s was 330. The worst in the 2000s. So I think 2017 still remains the worst, was 1,400. So
yeah, I believe 2020 is projected to be higher.
On pace to be worse. So it's not it was a double whammy where they massively increased the user base from they just pumped up the user base of opioid users through prescription drugs. Then they killed the pharmaceutical supply by clamping down on prescriptions, and then a super deadly illegal supply. So now there's a huge user base. I think right now they estimate as many as 1 million Canadians are consistent users of opioids illegally. So there's a huge, a massively expanded user base and a toxic supply.
Yeah. To put some background to this as well, to show what happened and how this occurred. So from my research, one of the things that's been noted consistently by the U.S. government and others is that what happened was there's the 4 vital signs in the medical community. So that's blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, and what's the other one? Temperature. So those are considered the 4 vitals. If one of them gets severely out of line, you're in trouble. And the medical community, I think it was probably sometime in the 80s, they started shifting towards adding pain as a 5th vital. So a part of a doctor's role was to help manage the patient's pain and treat it as a very serious, life-threatening condition. And so with this change in the way doctors treated patients, they needed to. I guess they needed to. They were looking for like new tools in order to help with this, and along came the pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical companies, as Price had said, earlier there had become like, for some reason there was some pretty shoddy science that showed that opioids were not addictive, even though many years before.
I researched that because that was my preconception. And from what I could find, the science wasn't even shoddy. The studies that were taken as supporting the claims that opioids were not addictive did not show that opioids were not addictive. They were just simply tacked on to the claims that opioids were not addictive without actually showing that or being related in any direct fashion to opioids. And doctors have all the incentive to prescribe these opioids, and they'd look at a piece of paper and would say, opioids aren't addictive, look at all our sources. And those sources didn't say that. So it was very, this is why they lost, I believe it's an $8 or $9 billion lawsuit just this year.
Yes, so that's really interesting. I knew that there, like from the research that I've been doing, that the medical community had the absolute wrong idea that opioids were not addictive, and these companies, they were looking to market these new drugs, and they were hyper aggressive. So they would do things such as they would figure out what doctors liked for food, liked for entertainment, that type of thing, and then they would just brown nose the hell out of them. One sales guy figured out that the doctor that he was targeting liked sweet things, so he got a big tray of donuts that spelled out Oxycontin and sold the doctor on it. So what happened is you had this kind of weird mixture of a change in philosophy plus these companies figuring out like a new product and just ramming it down the doctor's throats, and then the medical community, it seems like they really didn't do their due diligence. So then you wind up, that's how that user base got pumped up. Like there was a couple of things that happened. And then
and with the medical community, I also kind of looked into this. I believe the roots of the medical community's, how would you say, like lowering of their guard against opioids began in the Vietnam War, because in Vietnam there was an incredibly high rate of heroin addiction by Vietnamese soldiers or American soldiers fighting in Vietnam, and they would have heroin and they would have morphine, and they'd come back to America, and their relapse rates for their opioid addictions were somewhere around 5%, which was unheard of. The previous studies were indicating around 60 to 80% in the American population. So these studies effectively laid the seeds to say, maybe these aren't super addictive, and like we have to look at the environment that people are in that causes them to do these drugs, and kind of undermined this like no opioids ever attitude that had come out of the 1800s.
Yeah, I definitely have seen that. Actually, there's a guy on Joe Rogan he's a journalist, and he wrote a whole book on opioids, and then his conclusion was that opioids like that chemical hook theory is just incorrect or is way overplayed, and it's all about the environment, and it's
an incredibly dangerous perspective to take because it leads to overprescription, like we've seen.
Well, I think it's dangerous potentially in the medical community, although I don't think it's wrong. Well, it's not entirely wrong.
I don't think it's entirely wrong, but I think
the medical community has it's not just for opioids; it's other things where they've kind of they've overemphasized kind of brain chemistry and just said, "Oh, that's the only thing that matters." And well, maybe that's a little strong, but they have gone kind of in that direction where, basically they treat people as, a brain in a jar with the, trying to just get the chemistry right, which is not necessarily the only angle to look at the problem. So
You don't take
I
a
do think
holistic view.
Yeah, it's like the very valid point. The issue, I believe, is that the medical community and people in general have a hard time with a nuanced, not one or the other kind of perspective. And if they start falling towards it's the environment, not the drug, then the tendency is to continue to fall towards that until you disregard the biological aspect. And regardless of the cause of addiction, I think that prescribing these opioids can be the outcome was bad of their perspective, even if it was the right perspective.
I mean, I don't disagree totally, but I feel like it's more, you have to heap like a lot. I didn't do as much research into it, but just my perception of it is like you have to heap most of the blame at the feet of the pharmaceutical companies that were basically trying to peddle it, right, for profit, and they were doing like they were just exerting an insanely high amount of pressure at every point they could, legislatively especially in the U.S., legislatively through the medical insurance, the insurance system, through every single avenue they could to peddle opioids. And it's like, doctors, I feel like the doctors' treatment, like their outlooks was not a large contributing factor to that shift. I feel like it was pretty much pharmaceutical companies trying to force through huge revenue on the drugs they developed.
Yeah, I think you're right on the primary cause being the pharmaceutical companies. All I'm trying to get at is I think that was because when you look at the late 1800s, like the aftermath of the first opioid epidemic in the U.S., and you look at how it happened again, a lot of people are quick to say the lessons were just forgotten, and it's like, well, there's like a chink in the armor, and probably a valid chink that was then exploited, and it's just it's how they exploited a valid finding in order to get where the results they wanted.
I guess what I would say to that though is like the responsibility probably needs to, like, the reform isn't to tell doctors, oh, you can't explore these different perspectives, because that's not viable, because you're always going to need to have doctors take new perspectives and go down new avenues, and they might get it wrong sometimes, but the predominant problem, because I think if you extend it past the opiate crisis, you can take the same analysis on something like ADHD. Like ADHD, you could say, oh, the doctors missed the environmental contributors to children being diagnosed. It's, by and large, they're diagnosing kids that don't have much of a problem, that are just, in a shitty school system that doesn't, accommodate their personality or their temperament. And the doctors prescribe the drugs. Well, the doctors aren't, I don't think you can lay the blame at the doctor's feet for viewing kids the way they do. Yes, they probably have a messed up perspective for that as well. I think you have to, again, drive it back to the pharmaceutical companies trying to peddle fucking Ritalin 24/7. Like, that's why it's happening. Like, if Ritalin didn't exist, there wouldn't be a problem. Like, it just wouldn't be. I think, again, it comes back to, you have to put the blame at the foot of the pharmaceuticals for, like, if you want to change it, I guess is what I would say.
Well, I think, at least from the legal prescription perspective, yes. I think now the crisis, I think it's got a bit of a, I think we'll get into this a bit more, but I do think that now that the user base has grown, it's going to take some time to work through that large population of addicts. And so even if you clamp down on, which I do think you absolutely have to clamp down on the pharmaceutical companies, that was a part of what I always had a suspicion that the pharmaceutical companies were largely to blame, but like, it's definitely the case that these guys were, like, they lost a lot of lawsuits, like you were saying, and rightly so. Some of these, I was reading some of the lawsuits, and like their marketing tactics were just unbelievably manipulative and shady. Like they essentially built profiles on each of the doctors and used that to game them. So, but I do think that
that's systemic to all, like, like it's a relationship problem between pharmaceutical industry and doctors themselves, right? Like,
yeah,
it's a broader problem.
Well, it's not. It's placing. It's fundamentally, in my opinion, a broken way of doing it. It's like medicine should not be viewed in the same. Like, I'm not one of those types of people who think too critically of something like capitalism, like, or look at it through, oh, we need to be a socialist, completely socialist country or something like that. But there's definitely some places where the market has way too negative of an impact, and it has to be regulated a lot more so than it is in the States with the drug companies. I think this is one of those areas that clearly is a big problem. And I think probably getting a little bit off track, jumping around a bit too much. So what did you guys discover in terms of like the actual numbers for like BC and the States, and like is this actually a pretty widespread problem? Is it people making a little bit too much of it, or what did you guys find?
Well, I mean, we already kind of discussed some of the numbers for BC, where they thought it was bad in the 90s, and that was 300 deaths a year, and now it's 1,400 for 2017. And although basically every analysis I looked at was 2019 was the first year that was like, it was actually down pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
I noticed that too. Well, I think we should probably put like the whole numbers into context in general. So for the States in 2018, they had roughly 47,500 people die of drug overdoses related to opioids. And just to show how much that actually is, 36,560 people died in 2018 due to car accidents. And car accidents are like one of the major causes of death in the United States. So it's 30% more people die of drug overdoses related to opioids than do in car accidents, which is quite astounding. And another fun fact that I ran into is more people have died in Alberta and BC this year in 2020 from opioid-related deaths, drug overdoses, than have died to COVID. So it's...
Well, that one's not even close. Like,
yeah, well, that one, like, Alberta and BC have never really we're just getting into a real wave of COVID now.
Yeah,
but how that goes.
It's interesting. It's like, you have a worldwide pandemic that's killed 1.5 million people or so, and maybe it's 1.3 or something like that. But like it just shows like the overdose deaths are pretty wild.
Well, the number that shocked me the most is that almost the entirety of the growth between, say, the mid 2000s and now has been due to overdose deaths from fentanyl. Like, overdose deaths from opioids other than fentanyl basically static, and I believe in Alberta they've actually declined. Like, I knew fentanyl was bad, but I just didn't realize how bad fentanyl was.
Yeah, I can give some actual numbers for that. So in Vancouver Coastal Health, these are 2018 numbers. 87% of overdose deaths involve fentanyl. So,
and I think those American numbers, I think it's like 75 or 80%, if I remember correctly.
And yeah, it just followed. Like, fentanyl just shows up over and over and over again. Like, 87% of heroin samples in 2018 for the Vancouver Coastal Health had fentanyl in them. And yeah, like you can, the numbers definitely match what Price was saying, where I think 2016 it was about half of the deaths were overdose deaths were fentanyl related in Canada, and that climbed to I think the mid 70s by 2018. Again, so in 2 years, the number of fentanyl related, the involvement of fentanyl in overdose deaths had gone up 50% from 50 to 75, and pretty much the whole growth in overdose deaths could be tracked to just the increase in fentanyl deaths themselves. Like, it's pretty much, and again, that goes back to it being more of a, since the mid 2000s, being more of a toxic supply problem than a user problem. Like, the user base is already there, and that's not like hasn't really changed, it seems, too much. And the interventions they've done hasn't really done much to change that until you actually moderate the supply in some way to make it less deadly. Then you're just going to have high overdose deaths until the kind of the user base declines, which again, 2019 did look like a actual decline. I mean, it's hard to say from 1 year, but even the beginning of 2020, first 3 months, had the indications were the same kind of 2019 trend of a reduction in overdose deaths. And then, of course, pretty much from April on, overdose deaths went crazy. And even our health minister, what's her name?
Are you talking about Tam? Yeah.
Yeah, she even was talking about this back in the summer, that they expect a huge increase in overdose deaths, for number one reason being an increase in the toxicity of the supply, essentially because the supply of opioids is going to dry up, and they're going to have to rely, like, more and more people are going to have to go to more extreme types of, like, fentanyl and carfentanil and other analogs.
So did they say why the supply is going to dry up? Is it just because they're going to stop prescribing it as much, or people are not going to be able to go to the doctor?
No, because all the border closures.
Oh, because India stopped exporting a whole bunch of different drugs, and they're one of the major producers in the world.
So, the illegal supply has been hit really hard by all the border closures in general. It's just harder to smuggle shit when less people are moving around the world. So they just knew there was going to be an increase or like a lowering in the quality of illegal drug supply because of the border closures.
So it's going to be more reliant on something like fentanyl, which is really powerful and
easy to send without even doing border crossings and stuff. So
one of the things that I came across in my research about fentanyl is, in Canada, the VPD put out a big report on fentanyl and the overdose crisis in BC, and they said one of the major challenges is, because fentanyl comes from China predominantly, and what the Chinese smugglers have figured out, that the Canadian Border Agency cannot open up mail that is below 30 grams in weight, and because fentanyl, it only takes 2 milligrams to kill you. So 30 grams is 15,000 lethal doses. So what the Chinese smugglers started doing is just sending little envelopes over with, all you need to do is send over a package with like 28 grams worth of stuff, and you are at almost no risk of being caught. It's very easy. You can do that hundreds, if not thousands of times, no problem. And so it's just, it can flood the market. So the cops it really seems like the cops are like, they're looking for different ways, because it seems like stymieing the supply is extremely difficult with fentanyl.
Well, it's just so easy to move. It's insane. Like, they've said there have been cases where a drug dealer gives a fatal dose to someone accidentally because they've prepared that drug on the same table they were cutting other drugs with fentanyl with, and a few grains of fentanyl got on this other drug that they weren't anticipating.
And that's enough to just kill the person who consumes the other one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just surprised that they don't have, work
Where's
safe.
OHS?
Yeah, where's their kitchen inspection to make sure everything's clean? What's that training course?
Food safe.
Food safe.
You need drug safe, BC.
Drug safe. Well, maybe all the outraged pharmacist kids can get a job in the drug trade.
True.
Well, apparently the pharmacy is having a big meltdown these days, so they got room to grow in the drug trade. Yeah, the other numbers that we didn't go too deep into is the demographic information.
Yeah, I think we should touch on that.
Because we talked a lot in our initial pre-research impressions about the demographics that we kind of expected. So there was, just given what all three of us said, there was some unsurprising things. We are all kind of on the right track with men being overrepresented. It varies on the area, but it's basically between 2/3 and 80% of the overdose deaths, depending where you look, are men. Age group, I think we're a little, at least me and Con, we're a little off in terms of age group, where it actually is the highest risk age group is like the 30 to mid 50s, not like your 20 to 29-year-olds. Yes, they have a risk, but they're actually lower risk.
It's more of like a middle-aged white male issue, for sure. Like, and Native American as well.
I was gonna say the race data is like god awful. Like, just trying to find any of it is just near impossible, because probably it's just all scrubbed because woke people don't want race data out there on anything, so it's just impossible to find. The only one that I did find for BC was the Vancouver Coastal Health, and this is how bad it is. So 57% of cases, the race wasn't even recorded, so that's useful. Like, it's just, oh my god, it's garbage. But and then for the recorded, so there's 43% that was recorded, 10%, so about 25% of the recorded individuals were Aboriginal, 1%, so it was 4 or 5% were Latino, 4% were Asian, so that's like 10% of the recorded, about 10%, so 4% were other, and 23%, so just over half of the recorded was Caucasian. And this, again, this is just BC, so you'd have to check the baselines, but yeah, it does seem to skew white, and then, like Con was saying, actually very, very high percentage of Aboriginal.
Yeah.
I think I didn't clearly mention my thoughts on demographics before, but initially I thought that it was predominantly working class males, because they were going to be getting pain prescriptions. One of the other things that shocked me was just how widespread this problem seems to be everywhere in Western Canada and everywhere in the United States.
Yeah, it is something that was something that surprised me too, that it is a lot more, like, it's definitely concentrated in particular areas. Like, Western Canada has gotten, especially BC accounts for like roughly 1/3 of all overdose deaths since 2016 in Canada, which is pretty wild considering we're definitely not 1/3 of the population. But in the States, I noticed too that it really actually has moved pretty rapidly throughout large swathes of the entire population. Something that I did notice, though, from doing the research, because most of my research actually centered on the United States, it was predominantly a middle-aged working male.
I will really push back on the notion that it's like it isn't the underclass or the lower class. Like, it's not, because Price was saying in his initial impressions that it was like the media perception was that it's, people that it can happen to anyone. Well, it's true to a certain extent, but like, if you look at the data, it really is basically people that are already spiraling in life that it ends up happening to. Like it
depends if you're talking opium addiction or opium overdose leading to death. Like, I'll agree on the overdose and death because that's clearly the case. But opium addiction, it seems like it would probably happen to anybody.
Yeah, but I think the point is, like, most people say basically a sustained opium addiction ends up in death. That's pretty much what happens. And the reason you don't see hardly any like high functioning people end up dead is because, yes, they might get addicted to it, but they kick it fairly quickly. So their environment does matter. Like, they're able to overcome it and move on. Whereas, like, it's the people without any support that end up getting stuck in the spiral so strongly that they can't get out. Like, if you have some sort of support and some sort of, like, purpose and some sort of... So, like, if you look at the data, 72% had no employment of the overdose deaths, and 12% had unstable employment, and only 8% had some sort of steady employment. Again, this data comes out of West Virginia. 56% of overdose deaths had an incarceration history. Most were never married. Most had no high school or just a high school education. Like, it really isn't your college graduate with a decent job that's getting addicted and dying. It's because those people, yes, they might get addicted. I agree, but they usually, within not so long of a time frame, get clean because they have the support, they have the resources. And I think that comes back to the original point I was talking about with the environment, where they have a purpose, they have a meaningful life, they have other things, other people in their lives willing to support them, and their environment just isn't conducive to sustained addiction. Whereas these people that are overdosing don't have any of that. So that's where the environment plays a part, where they just can't get out of it.
Yeah, well, it's definitely the demographics between... this is why, in my mind, it makes sense to separate it into two events, because the demographics between opium addicts and between people dying of opium overdose are, like, completely different. Like, you'd see it as even with sex, with people dying of accidental opioid overdose not involving synthetic opioids like fentanyl or carfentanil are 50-50 male and female in Alberta. And as soon as you get into synthetics, it becomes 75 to 80% male.
Well, and again, I think that's because it's two different types of situation, right? Like, it's someone who's, you also see like this kind of a pattern for cocaine, actually. Well, it's not a similar pattern, but it's another analogous situation where lots of people get addicted to cocaine in their 20s and early 30s, and then they have a few years of sustained use, and then they quit. It doesn't actually end up playing a decisive role in killing them or fucking up their life forever. It's just it's a bad habit they develop and get rid of. And I think that's kind of like analogous to opioids. It's like, for some people it's a bad habit that they kick, and for other people it becomes their life. Like, it becomes their reason for existence, and that's the demographic that ends up dying to it. And that's the demographic where you have, like, very little that does match the media perception, I guess, of your typical drug addict, in the sense that the stereotypes do kind of hold up for that group.
The one group is the typical, what you think of, like, the urbanite pill poppers, and then the other group is the stereotypical homeless person who's shooting up downtown east side.
Yeah, or just chronically dysfunctional, right? Like, doesn't even have to be, like, homeless. It's just someone that has has a bad situation in life and they don't have enough support to pull themselves out of the spiral, right? They're at zero basically, and they can't get a leg up and figure it out, which I think because although the data is pretty damning in the sense like most of the people that have an overdose go like a good chunk of the people that have an overdose go on to have multiple overdoses, and a lot of them end up dead. So it's if you're at a level of drug use where you're overdosing, it's pretty bleak, at least for opioids.
Yeah, I haven't seen any data on the overdoses by non-synthetic users. The one I can see is 8% of deaths that aren't synthetic, 8% of non-synthetic opioid deaths, they had previously had a opioid overdose in the last month versus 10% with synthetic deaths. So it's that stat's pretty close, but like a month is a very small time frame.
I think it's hard to also like get good data out of it because a lot of these people don't like. It's just collecting data.
They're not going to be reporting, right? I think like what I'd be really interested in, I couldn't really discern as much as like how much, like what the actual like cost of people being addicted to opioids and like being able to get out of it, but like I guess the severity of addiction, like where the bright lines are between like when you fall into that really bad spiral and like what the demographics are for that, like that's hard to parse. That was the one thing that I was trying to sort out, but like you said, the data is pretty weak with this, with a lot of it. But from what I noticed, though, a lot of it does have to do with the environment. Like if there isn't a lot of economic development in the area, if you have like if there's chronic joblessness in the area, that's like the major like it's a major indicator of like deaths of despair. I don't know if you guys ran into that.
I also think that's why the incarceration information is pretty informative. Like in BC, 20% of the overdose deaths had been previously incarcerated versus 0.6% of the baseline population, and incarceration history was associated with a 4.1 times higher risk of overdose death. So it just shows you that if your options are limited and you have, you know, you don't have many options and many paths forward, you might just get stuck in drug use as you're basically
as your full existence.
Exactly, like that seems to be what happens to people is if they don't have enough support and enough purpose and enough meaningful relationships, that kind of thing, that they can leverage. If they do get stuck on opioids, it just becomes their life until such a time that it just basically kills them.
Yeah, it's just.
Oh, but the other thing to take into account with this particular crisis is like there'd be like a sort of threshold for what percentage of people are basically not going to make it versus going to make it, and that you could set that at like 5-10%, whatever you want. But that threshold for people that aren't going to make it has gone up like probably 4 or 5 times due to the introduction of fentanyl. Like it's caused so much more adverse outcomes for like the average or like below average, but like there's a lot more people that are falling into that not going to make it category because they've used opioids for a couple years, because of fentanyl than would if there wasn't fentanyl.
Yeah, that is something that I came across and like really felt was the driving force behind this. And that's what Hubbard said with like toxic supply. This probably wouldn't be nearly as big of a crisis had you not had something as unbelievably powerful and available and cheap as fentanyl. It really is, to me, the big driving factor. You know, like in the early 90s where you had 300 overdose deaths in BC, like that's a big deal, but it's manageable. You'd probably be able to sort that out. Whereas this one, I guess we could kind of move into, like we've covered quite a bit of ground here in the deep dive. I think maybe we can, you know, do our comparison now to like our like updated view and compared to what we
I think we
is
kind of
going on.
have been doing that because we were talking about demographics here compared to what we expected.
Yeah. Oh, one thing I noticed interestingly is like in the States, it's really not like the black population has definitely seen a spike up in this, but it's not nearly the same level as Caucasians or Native Americans, which I found rather odd. And they don't, of course, the general New York Times take on it was doctors are racists and they won't prescribe drugs to black people because they think they're going to sell them or abuse them. That was the New York Times explanation, which I thought was rather odd. But I did find that to be interesting that and Asians, they had they've seen a little uptick, but it really is not the same uptick you see with whites and you see with Native Americans. So I do think it really points strongly towards like support network breakdowns and stuff like that, but which also makes it odd that the black community doesn't have the same spike.
The black community pretty much has held steady with the white community in terms of overdose deaths for the last like years, and they pretty much are both racial groups are pretty much proportionally represented in overdose deaths as far as I could tell. I think in like the last year published full data for it was like 76% white and like 14% black or 13% black, so it was like almost proportional. Like it was very
but wait, isn't that way higher than proportional for Caucasian, or are they including Hispanics in that data?
No, that's non-Hispanic whites. So the only like notable thing was whites are a bit more represented, like not hugely. I think what are they, the U.S. population? They've got to be like close to 70.
I think they fell below 70.
But again, this wasn't.
I'm seeing 68%.
Yeah, and so they probably would have been around 70% because I think it was 2018 data that I was looking at. So, so they're a bit, and actually the one group that was underrepresented was non-Caucasian, like Latinos, whatever the term.
Yeah, just Hispanic Caucasian.
Yeah,
the
Hispanic.
Correct American term, because Hispanic is a modifier.
Exactly. They were like noticeably below their population metrics. So I just don't know if there's like, I think there is maybe something to the story of like, how would you call it, like deaths of despair being maybe more likely to happen for white people in the US because it might be like your comparative position in society that you could link to that, but I just don't think there's like a ton of evidence that shows one way or another why it's happening, or even that it's like that big of a difference or a significant enough difference to really merit much.
From what I had read in my research, there was like a significant difference, which had people like the New York Times and others in New York Mag looking for reasons why. But whether it was actually like enough to be statistically significant to the point where it would be really worth a lot of investigation, it didn't say, but they were quite flustered about it, Put it that way.
You've kind of got it backwards there, because statistical significance is very easy to achieve. Whether or not it had any practical significance.
Yeah, sorry. There should be
question.
practical significance. It's like maybe there was just a small statistical difference, but significant, but enough.
Like there could be like a million, at least for that reason. There could be like a million different variables that might be like, maybe it's more kind of in the, say, especially for the U.S., maybe it's more like rural areas that are at risk of overdose death for whatever reason. Like, I'm sure you could come up with a reason, and then that would obviously implicate both white people and Native Americans being more at risk, right? Like, so it could be as innocuous as something like that, where it's just we're not understanding.
No. It's racist doctors not prescribing opioids to black people. That's
the big thing
clearly
that
what it is.
crossed my mind looking at just a map of where America's opioid deaths are, and this is all it's based on, is and Canada, is that there's got to be like a supply chain, like a distribution network that just branches out into like the neighboring states and areas, and that's got to have a huge effect on where it's actually breaking out, because I can't see a good reason for why it hasn't reached Eastern Canada other than just simple lack of supply.
Yeah, that is interesting, because
Centered
BC and
around
Alberta.
Fentanyl. Like, there's, I believe there's one gang, a Chinese gang, that was implicated in the majority of the fentanyl trafficking in British Columbia.
They just haven't been able to branch all the way out to the east
It's just
yet.
weird that they could get it to Ontario from BC. That just seems so weird.
Well, it's so
and it seems to be pretty prevalent on the east coast of America too, as opposed to the east coast of Canada, which is
You
also
could literally
bizarre.
drive one vehicle across Canada and like supply all of Ontario with
enough fentanyl to kill the whole province, essentially.
It's literally one car drive that would be your distribution network. To be fair, I with drugs, the distribution and logistics is much more about like the trust network of like exchanging the drugs and like the dealer territory and all that stuff, which is like, I'm sure, very complicated. So I don't know, maybe that's a part of it. Like, the gangs in Ontario just don't want BC supply getting shipped over, and they're willing to fight. I don't know.
Yeah, don't want to kill all their own users.
Like, who knows? Like, I'm sure that could definitely be a possibility as well. Yeah, that it's just literally the gangs from BC can't get it over to Ontario without getting into a gang war properly, or something shit like that. Like, who knows? Like, yeah, it could be as simple as that. Did you guys have any other surprises or like discrepancies between what you had thought prior to the?
Because it's always labeled as like the opioid epidemic. Like, I was surprised at just the small proportion. Like, I already said I was surprised at the large proportion of fentanyl deaths, but I was also surprised at the small proportion of opioid deaths. Like, it wasn't for fentanyl, I don't think people would really be calling this an opioid crisis, even though there's a large number of addicts.
Yeah, that's, I mean, first quarter of 2020, and again, the first quarter of 2020 was down compared to like the peak. 17% of opioid overdoses were pharmaceutical only. So, yeah, you take out a good 80% of the deaths are probably not going to actually cause concern to anyone. It's just going to be, you know what I mean? Like, the fentanyl deaths are what really are bringing such a big spike that everyone's paying attention. Well, although people have stopped paying attention with COVID, but I mean, I guess
that kind of swamped everything. Well, actually, not in BC. Like, one of the things that my work does, it's put on seminars and get out. What is it? Naloxone or
naloxone? Something like that.
Something like that. They put on seminars how to do that.
Naloxone,
yeah, that's it. And how to like get a hold of these kits and then how to use them. So, like, I do think there's actually pretty good awareness. Like I was surprised at like the general awareness. I think in a place like Van, just considering that I think it's just so big of a problem in BC. But one of the things that I found a little surprising is I went and looked up like the actual like estimated costs of the epidemic in the States, and the estimates vary from like 600 billion over 4 years to $2.5 trillion that it's been just like in medical, lost wages, all sorts of productivity costs. And it's quite staggering how rough it is on the society. Like, just like, I know that sounds very clinical to put it into dollar terms, but you know, if I do think that it's a valid way of trying to look at it. But like
one of the wild stats, like the cost on society in Canada that I saw was, seems like it's not uncommon for a hospital to have about 4% of their total emergency visits be due to overdose on opioids. And the worst one in Canada, 14% of their emergency room visits were due to opioid overdose.
Yeah, that's just such a massive tax on your, especially in something like COVID times. Like, Jesus, like that is such a tough, like with the numbers that BC is posting right now, like that has to absolutely strain some of the hospitals.
Most of the overdose individuals have like consistent interaction with the healthcare system over years before they die.
Yeah, exactly. You're not coming in once and then wind up on a gurney. Like,
and they're constantly in and out of the hospital with various issues. And
yeah. And like you're not gonna have insurance. You're not gonna have like the whole footing of the cost is gonna go directly to the public. So it's just I knew it was gonna be an expensive thing from a economic standpoint, but how expensive it actually is pretty wild. Like that surprised me. Looking forward, what are your guys' thoughts on, you know, like what could be done about this? Like, do you think that this right steps are being taken, or is it, you know, an intractable problem, or what are your policy prescriptions?
I just think like the real, like, it's hard to say for sure because it does seem like a difficult problem, but like the two possible like strong solutions are not very popular for different reasons. So one solution is to basically provide a cleaner supply of basically pharmaceutical grade opioids to whoever wants it. And monitor like the safe injection sites, but with even better like drugs, essentially. But for various reasons, that's obviously not politically very palpable for a lot of people. Just like giving away super strong opioid drugs to people in a safe injection site, that would bring down the deaths. Whether or not that would do much in the long run for helping curb addiction, probably not much. And then the second thing for like addiction is just to like institutionalize a good chunk of people that are in this situation, because they're basically in, it seems like most of the people that are going to be dying, overdosing, or continuously in contact with the healthcare system would just be undoubtedly better off in an institution. But that's super unpopular on both political sides for various reasons. Like on the left, it's hard sell because you're quote unquote not treating drug users like people, or it's not compassionate to institutionalize them. It's mean, blah blah blah. On the right, it's just expensive.
Yeah, exactly. So it costs money. Don't do that. Just leave them out.
The right is just like, oh, stop being a drug addict. It's easy. Like, just don't do drugs. Like,
yeah, it's like that's just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, man. You can do it.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
and then the last like option or like prescription would be like, well, there's not really a. This is where it gets like impossibly difficult to solve. But you basically need to try to generate like because this isn't unique just to opioid overdoses. Like, this is deaths of despair in general, and just like an overall societal trend of purposelessness and meaninglessness, and especially among like working age men, where because all their jobs are being shipped off overseas and automated, they have nothing to do and they don't feel useful, and so they just get involved with all sorts of self-destructive behavior.
Well, I think another huge one is disconnected.
And I was gonna include that, like loneliness and lack of community. That's like the whole society. I think like the lack of purposelessness and meaningfulness is like it is society wide as well, but it's like massively targeted on like the working age men, right? So that's why
it's like the way to keep the meaning, or to keep the disconnected loneliness at bay has gone.
Yeah, you don't actually have at least something to provide like a bulwark against that. I would say I would agree with your prescriptions. I think trying to cut off the supply of this drug, of fentanyl, I don't think it's possible. Like, I think you could dump $1 billion into trying to stop it, and it's just not going to happen. I think it's just way too easy, and they'll just switch to, what is it, carfentanil or whatever it is, which is 100 times more powerful than fentanyl, which is already disturbingly powerful. So it's like, to me, you have to solve the societal issues first. Like, the supply issues, it's not going to happen. So
honestly, it'd probably be easier to come to an agreement with China to stop it than it would to be to try to stop it on our side of things.
Yeah,
that's actually what the Trump administration was working on, if I understand correctly, was trying to strong arm China. Well, I don't even know if it's strong arm. I just assume trying to get China to increase the classification on their opioids and opioid production facilities, and like keep better track of the products they make. And I think they got agreement on that to an extent.
Oh, good thing they have another 4 years to work it out.
Yeah. So, but I actually, I was just considering that, and I hadn't even thought of that solution. But that does seem like the best possible solution, if you could somehow get the Chinese government on board.
I was going to say, it seems like China would have better luck at monitoring their borders and cracking down on illegal activity, given that I don't think they would have a problem with searching packages under 30 grams, and that they like literally would do whatever it takes and root it out ruthlessly. I know they're pretty harsh on drugs in general already, but like, yeah, they would have no qualms about just absolutely crushing traffickers if they decided to do it, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I really do think that would be probably the only supply side issue that could be done. But even then, I think you still need to deal with the societal issues. If you don't do that, there can always be something else that comes along. Like, imagine I guarantee you that if there's the demand there, like if you don't solve both supply and demand sides, you're still going to have a problem. Like, just imagine if Brazil got their shit together in terms of producing this stuff. It's like, do you think the government there could actually crack down properly? It's just not going to happen, right? Like, it could easily be that another country took the place of China. I think it would be absolutely worth getting a deal done with China to stop it, because it would really help slow things down. But I think you will have to deal with the other side, because I was doing research into deaths of despair. You have a lot of people just killing themselves outright, and a lot of the reasons for those deaths are very much the same reason they get into the opioids and then have the overdose problems. So you might as well try to go for both.
That is a good point to distinguish. So the information that I looked at, the number I found was 94% of overdose deaths were ruled accidental, so not intentional suicide. And of the 6% remaining, most of those were, I think, not all of those were suicides. Some were just unknown. So it's actually a pretty small, pretty inconsequential amount of the deaths are intentional suicides, and that actually it's not really increased that much either.
it's a small amount are labeled intentional suicides. It's one of those things that's very hard to, unless they actually leave a suicide note. I don't think it would be labeled intentional suicide.
It's true. It's hard to distinguish, but I think by and large that's accurate. It's not people who are going out that day to die, that overdose and die. I think it's people who are consistent users that have been doing the same drugs over and over again for months or years, and they're bound to have a fuck up, and it happens and they die. Like, that's why I think it's pretty safe to assume that most of them are accidents.
Yeah.
Because most overdoses don't lead to death. And if you're say a heroin user or a opioid user and you want to die, you can pretty much kill yourself. It's pretty easy. You just get a triple, quadruple, and you're dead. And you go somewhere where you're not going to be found, you die.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's pretty easy to kill yourself with it. Like ensure you're going to die from it, and most people don't die from it. So I think that's a pretty clear indication that most of the doses are accidental, and and most of the overdose deaths themselves are accidental because you're not.
Yeah, I just think, definitely the vast majority are accidental. But I always think when it's up to the third party to determine whether or not it was suicide, especially in North America, they're always erring on the side of saying it was accidental. So I'd say it's at least double the percentage that they claim to be suicidal or suicidal.
I don't think that's fair. You can just say double, but it's very possible that it is underestimated. But I still think that leaves you with the ultimate conclusion that the vast majority are still accidental. Like, at least 90% are accidental.
Oh, at least 90, yeah.
Yeah, so which again is like, if the numbers were 1/10 what they are now, I don't think people would really pay much attention. So if it was just the suicides, you wouldn't be getting it wouldn't be that consequential, but it's because of all the accidental that you're really getting the attention.
Yeah, I would agree with your prescriptions in the sense that, like, there's going to have to be some societal fixes. Like I think there is a pretty big problem with men not having a place as much as they used to. Like, they can't, they're not seen as, like, I think for a good chunk of guys, they're just not seen as useful. They don't have a place to contribute properly. They can't, like it used to be that you were at least doing something functional, but if you have a job that now is just some sort of like shitty like contract work that pays barely above minimum wage when you used to have a mill job, like that's really hard on people. One of the things that when I was doing the research on deaths of despair, they noticed that it's not poverty or income inequality that correlates with these deaths. It's joblessness. So people who have actually left the workforce, who are just not even bothering to look, even though they could, like they're not interested in that. I think is a generally like a large societal problem, and it's obviously impacts men a lot more than women for various reasons. But like the major one being, like, I do think that guys they really do need some form of like a productive job. That's not to say women don't either, but I do think it's even more of a drive for guys.
Clear evolutionary logic there, where men don't contribute nearly as much to the reproductive equation, and that's just factual in terms of they don't grow a baby in their stomach for 9 months and have a baby and breastfeed and all that, so they just do less in terms of actually contributing value to having a child, and then so their contribution is generally outside of that realm, geared towards resource acquisition in whatever form. And in the modern world, that means working some sort of generally wage job. So if you're not doing that, then you're not basically you're not contributing to society, or you're not carrying out your kind of pre-programmed role. Which is not to say that like people have to do that. It's just like there's a whole bunch of things hardwired into your brain saying, if you're not doing this, something's wrong.
And
set off alarm bells in your brain when you're not doing something, because evolutionarily you've done it for 300 million years or whatever. So it's going to basically screw with your mental health if you're not carrying out a function that was deemed for 300 million years to be essential to your success as an organism.
Yeah, if that's been taken away, there's going to be a huge disconnect, and I think that's really impacted a good chunk of men, and particularly that's why I think you see it a lot in the Rust Belt, where a lot of these jobs have been automated and lost. That was like basically a huge portion of Andrew Yang's campaign was just looking at this, because he noticed all the data and just said, well, Jesus, there's something seriously wrong here. And it really does, I think, come down to a loss of purpose and a loss of income stability. And I think until the society rectifies that somehow, I think you're going to have problems with this going forward.
Well, just to plug Yang for a bit, I also did like that. Yeah, I think he did pay attention a lot to that. And one of his talking points was to, obviously everything centered, his whole campaign was around UBI, but he paid special attention to the marketing and the branding of it as the freedom dividend, where he sold it as you have ownership in the country, and this is your return on the ownership in the country, which I think is really smart.
Yeah,
just
freedom
psychological perspective of letting people feel like them receiving $1,000 a month is earned, and they have a stake in the society that's producing that $1,000 a month for them. They have a stewardship role in terms of that society. And I think I think UBI, again, I'm a very large supporter. I think that would actually be a huge step in the right direction. And specifically Yang's framing around UBI. I think the framing of UBI for something like the opioid crisis would really matter. If you're someone who is addicted to opioids and you're getting the $1,000 a month, that could be very dangerous to you, having more cash to spend on drugs. But I think it could actually make a meaningful difference to you, how you treat that money, depending on how it's framed in terms of the way it's given to you and the way it's talked about and the way it's kind of viewed by the greater society.
Yeah, I think there has to be some forward-thinking ideas like Yang's. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse and worse. I don't see things slowing down. Just from like I was saying with the fentanyl, it's just it's not gonna. You can't stop that unless some really heavy-duty efforts are made. And
it did seem like opioid deaths were tapering off.
Yeah, I'm not too sure what that is, but I don't see.
I think that's just at least in Canada, I think that's the result of a clampdown on prescriptions and the user base is probably declining.
A cutoff of the user base. Well, I know that the Canadian government is doing a few things that I think the United States government probably should take a serious look at, and I thought these were actually quite wise. TAM is. They have requested that all of these companies stop marketing to doctors, while they're drafting laws right now that they're going to pass that heavily restricts advertising to doctors by pharmaceutical companies for opioids, which I think is pretty that's a pretty good stopgap move, and I think it might actually have some serious ramifications. I think it could help. So I shouldn't say that I don't see this not getting better. I do see it getting somewhat better, but I don't see it being I don't see there being an excellent resolution to it unless some of these bigger issues are solved. But that's the case for a lot of different things. But it would be nice. I definitely think a lot of this has to be, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of this is the fault of the pharmaceutical companies pushing this garbage on doctors, and then doctors throwing out these pills in way too cavalier of a manner. Yeah, I think you see that with benzos and a bunch of other, like Ritalin and a bunch of other things. And I really do think overall that like a good societal solution could be just heavy restrictions on these companies. But I think in the States, like they're just too wealthy that it might just not, in the US, it might be a problem, whereas Canada's way more open and willing to stopping it and is already taking action, which is good.
Well, I don't know if Price will agree, but I think going back to his point where he was saying like the doctors are not capable of a totally nuanced position and they probably lean one way or another. I think you can see that in our society with them basically seeing everything as like a brain chemistry problem that you can just prescribe away. And so if there is, I think there is, if you were to kind of put some responsibility on the doctors themselves, you could see a movement towards like a more like a lot less emphasis on just medicating as like the first reaction, like with like Ritalin you see that, or a million other things, anti-anxieties, depression drugs, like that. It just seems to be the main kind of first reaction by most doctors is just write a prescription.
Yeah, I think like you kind of have to choose your knee jerk, and I would definitely say that the knee jerk of under prescribing is going to be superior. But looking at just where like Canada's headed, I think the biggest thing is the fentanyl, and if you could snap your fingers and get rid of all the fentanyl, and you just stopped like everything, just we didn't even progress from where we are now. Like we're trending in the right direction.
Yeah,
which is
true.
A good thing. There's less prescriptions for opioids because it has become a very publicly a publicly discussed and understood thing that opioids are dangerous and can cause addiction. And I would almost be concerned that because of the public perception swinging so far towards opioids being incredibly addictive, that there could almost be too much backlash against opioid prescription. Like we're what would you call it? Tuning it in correctly, like it is going down, and you don't want it to go down to the point where it becomes difficult for people who genuinely require chronic pain medication to not be able to get it, because it's not the prescription ones that are killing people in the vast majority of cases. It's the whole slide into using fentanyl that is actually causing deaths and ruining many lives.
Yeah. It's, to me though, like the thing that I really understood from this, it's a complicated issue. Like it really is. There's no simple quick fix solution. Like Hubbard said, I think some of the solutions that should be done are very unpopular, but they really need to be implemented. And I think it's going to be one of those things, like, while it is good that it's trending in the right direction, I think it's still going to have some problems. I think we're still going to deal with this problem for another 5 or 10 years. Like, I don't think this thing is going to go away that quickly. I think we're going to have issues, but hopefully with some of the stuff that the Canadian government's doing, and even some of the Trump administration stuff actually looked like it might have an impact. Like,
yeah,
we might see some benefits.
In the same vein as that, like my concern properly articulated is that we're headed in the right direction right now, but no matter what we do, it's going to take, I would say, like 20 years to get it back to where we'll want it to be. And that since it'll take like around 20 years, would be even 10 years, there'll be an impulse to tighten things up more to get it to speed up faster, but that's going to end up overcorrecting potentially.
I think that's a possibility. I don't know. I just don't. Man, I don't know. I think technology might throw a few wrenches in the like the outlook for all this. Like, I think you might see technology, especially with pain management, take a different route than medication, such as
I heard him.
deep brain implants and stuff. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if there will be. I think there could be a lot of potential curveballs that will change the whole landscape of the problem around.
10 to 20 years is a long time frame in this day and age.
I read a really interesting article about it sounded as though he's a well-respected. What do you even call the guys who make drugs, like in the laboratory?
Chemist.
Anyway, yeah, he's a well-respected chemist, and he had developed a new painkiller from THC that was a cannabinoid that had previously not been able to be stabilized, and that had a lot of people excited about potentially having extremely good pain-killing effects without the addictive properties.
Well, yeah, I do know that that's actually been another area where a lot of like CBD oils as well, like people swear by them for pain relief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this would be like a CBD oil, but like 100 times stronger kind of thing.
And well, the thing with CBD is it has no psychoactive effect, so it doesn't even get you like weed high. It doesn't affect your mental state whatsoever, other than providing pain relief. Like it's just so. And again, I think there's going to be more than just one of those technological curveballs thrown. And I think even for addiction itself, more generally, I think you're going to see. Well, I think you could see technology fighting back. Like right now, technology is heavily in the favor of addicting people to like social media and everything else. But I could definitely see a world where they use technology to fight back against addiction heavily, right?
Give us the neural link that's anti-addictive. Yeah,
or just designing people's lives with technology to avoid it.
Falling into pitfalls and stuff like that.
Yeah, who knows? Like, there's a million different things you could think of where technology could play a role in combating addiction, but there hasn't been much done in that regard yet. But like, all the building blocks are seemingly there. It's just you need to give it some time for people to put it together. Like, I think so that I think we will see this continue to be a problem for decade or decades, but it's going to be, I think we're going to have things that come along that change the game in the next 10 to 20 years for sure.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about it just because I do think that like overall the trends are usually for things to get better, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime,
just the fentanyl is the one thing it seems hard to be optimistic about in the near term.
Yeah, it's true, but hopefully some people can come into the mix that have some that really are forward thinking, and those people can do the work that's required. I do think that we're kind of lagging behind and looking at things from a perspective that's limited. So, but I guess time will tell. Anyways, is there anything else that you guys wanted to cover quickly? Or think we got everything that you wanted to talk about?
I think we've covered the whole topic in perfect detail and depth. We have not left a single detail of importance out.
I agree.
As usual.
As expected.
Exactly. All right. Well, thanks a lot for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. Peace.
Peace.